economy, created cities, and basic income as a freelancer journalist.
Thanks both of you for doing that. Susa, if you can just come straight in now with playing Michael's video first, then after that play Luisa's video, and then Letitia's as well, and see if she has joined us by then. And enjoy it. Okay.
Okay, I'm hitting the same problem that I hit earlier in that I have your presentation open. It appears not to be amongst my options to share. Neil, have you done this before? Might you give it a go? Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll try this. See if this works. And then we'll try this. This might work.
Just got a blank screen, Susa. Are you getting away with this? Let me try and see if I can do it from being the host.
Was that not working?
No, it's not been working. I've loaded it on mine now, so I will try and share from my screen if you like. Seconds. Yes. Share screen. Let's just find the. Share screen. So I'm just following instructions. Share. Is that better? Can people see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Go to full screen.
I'm going to talk about some new opportunities for universal basic income in the United States and give particular emphasis to basic income as a part of environmental policy. But first, I want to talk about the remarkable expansion of basic income support in the United States in the last couple of years. This is due, I think, to two major factors. First is the remarkable campaign of Andrew Yang for president. In the wake of that campaign, social movements have formed from members of the Yang Gang and others interested in promoting basic income. The income movement, Humanity Forward, among the major ones, have now tens of thousands of members and are organizing at both grassroots levels and lobbying in Congress. Mayors for a Guaranteed Income has over 50 mayors of major cities who are supporting the idea of a guaranteed income. And the second factor is the response to the pandemic. Everybody now has experience of unconditional cash payments. And a poll in September showed that 76% of those polled support regular payments that will continue until the economic crisis is over. This support is reflected in proposals that emerged in the Congress. The House of Representatives Financial Services Committee, chaired by Maxine Waters, proposed $2,000 a month in cash payments to most adults and $1,000 a month for each child for the duration of the pandemic. It was a near universal basic income proposal. While these more radical proposals are not included in the bills that passed, there is one piece of legislation that should be noted and that is now the focus of movement activism, the emergency expansion of the child tax credit, which raises the amount going to children. It most importantly removes the work requirement so that a family of 4 with 2 children under 7, but no income from other sources would receive $7,200. Half of the credit is paid monthly beginning July 2021. And it starts phasing out only with household incomes above $150,000 for 2 parents. So 80% of all households and 90% of children will receive the full credit. This will lift over 4 million children out of poverty, cutting child poverty by almost half and over half for non-Hispanic Black children. The American Families Plan, which is not yet passed, would extend this benefit for at least another 5 years. So although it's not a universal basic income, it is the biggest step toward this in the United States. And I want to shift at this point to carbon fee and dividend as a step toward basic income. The idea of funding a basic income as a per capita share of common wealth is an idea going back at least to Thomas Paine. We have a living example of this in Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend. And Peter Barnes has broadened this idea to what he calls a base income between $3,000 and $5,000 per year per person, based on fees, among other things, for carbon emissions into the atmospheric commons. Carbon fees, he estimates, would account for about 20% of this base income, or around $1,000 per person annually in 2013 figures. Carbon fees are particularly interesting as a source for basic income because, first, they have not yet been claimed by anybody. Second, they are an essential part of a solution to an urgent problem, global warming and climate change. And third, the amounts are significant enough to make a difference in people's lives. Over 3,500 economists have pledged support for a carbon tax and dividend scheme. The carbon tax works in this way. First, a fee is charged on fossil fuels at their source. Although this is a regressive tax, if 100% of the net revenue is returned to households as a dividend, the policy on the whole will be progressive. In fact, the majority of households will be better off financially as a result of the carbon tax and the dividend than they would be without this policy. In recent years, there have been some encouraging signs. There's a movement for carbon fee and dividend called the Citizens Climate Lobby. It's been very active, generating support in local communities and lobbying in Washington. There's now a bill before Congress that is supported by Citizens Climate Lobby and a group of very prominent conservatives, although outside of Congress, have endorsed the concept. So one would think that this policy could have bipartisan support. Unfortunately, all the sponsors of the House bill are Democrats, and although a bill might pass the House, it is unlikely to pass in the Senate. Even more discouraging, there is no support for carbon pricing in the Biden administration. And has been some very strong opposition to carbon pricing from environmental and racial justice advocates. Although opponents raise many legitimate concerns that carbon dividend advocates need to take into consideration, many of the arguments against carbon dividends are unconvincing. Opponents assume an opposition of policies when the policies can and should be complementary. They compare their idealized versions of a Green New Deal, which includes government investment, regulation, and environmental justice measures, with existing carbon taxes or carbon cap and trade schemes heavily influenced by the fossil fuel industry. And often carbon dividends are completely ignored. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to address some of the arguments that have been raised. And when I speak of carbon pricing, let me say that this includes both a carbon fee and dividend, as I've just mentioned, but also carbon cap with an auction of permits, the revenue being distributed as a dividend. And finally, and what is usually the target of most of the critics, carbon cap and trade, which may or may not auction permits. And if they don't, then they're just giving away permits without holding companies responsible for the environmental cost. It may or may not include a dividend, and such cap and trade policies often include very questionable offsets. So the arguments against carbon pricing include, first, that existing carbon pricing is weak. Everywhere that carbon prices have been introduced, the price is too low to reduce carbon emissions as much as they need to be reduced. However, this is not an argument against carbon pricing, but rather an indicator of what needs to be done to improve carbon pricing. A second argument is that carbon pricing is difficult to enact. Only 12 states in the United States have any kind of carbon pricing. Australia and France have repealed their carbon taxes after much opposition, notably the Gilets jaunes movement. But again, this is not an argument against carbon pricing, and rather invites an analysis to make the policy better. In particular, a carbon tax could be made both more just and more popular if combined with a dividend. And the opponents fail to acknowledge that government regulation has been similarly inadequate and difficult to enact. Instead of carbon pricing, critics favor efficiency standards for power generation, transportation and buildings, energy investment, and climate justice measures. Well, at this late date of global warming, all of these things are needed. Time has passed for anybody to claim that carbon pricing can do the job without other measures. And if we don't have carbon pricing, the problem is that many sectors will simply not be covered. The proposals for building, transport, and electricity and heat leaves out manufacturing, for example. And as the Carbon Tax Center has argued, no pair or even array of subsidies, no matter how thoughtfully devised, can bring forth nearly the amount of carbon reductions that a carbon tax of comparable magnitude would elicit. The main reason is that subsidies that reward low carbon production cannot course through the economy as broadly and deeply as a carbon tax that rewards low carbon end use consumption as well as low carbon production. In the absence of carbon pricing, improvements in the efficiency of renewable energy are vulnerable to the rebound effect. As prices of renewables fall, people don't reduce overall energy consumption, they simply consume more. Even if optimistically, the transition to fossil-free energy could be achieved in the short time that we have, entirely by means of regulation and green investments, carbon pricing should be in the mix as an insurance policy. We want green investments and energy efficiency standards to bend the curve of carbon emissions downward at a rate that will accord with keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. But if these measures are inadequate, a firm cap to the introduction of carbon emissions will fill the gap. So in sum, carbon pricing should not be seen as an alternative, but as a complement to Green New Deal policies, without which the latter will be less effective. If investments and regulations in a Green New Deal were sufficient, the carbon price would be zero, and there would be no money for a dividend. Bad news for carbon pricing as a basis for basic income. However, for the reasons mentioned, the Green New Deal is likely to fall short, and carbon pricing will be needed to fill the gap. If the gap is large, the dividend could still be quite high. One key driver of environmental justice opposition to carbon pricing is the claim that carbon pricing, especially in California's cap and trade system, would increase pollution hotspots for communities of color. The worry was that cap and trade, by putting pressure on companies to reduce greenhouse gases, but giving them the flexibility to figure out how to meet their reduction targets, would result in emissions reductions where they were most expensive, but emissions increases where they were less expensive, precisely in the heavily impacted communities of color. This claim got empirical support from a 2018 study by Cushing et al. That concluded that with the introduction of cap and trade, carbon emissions actually went up in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. If this conclusion is correct, then the proper response would be to design carbon pricing to, first of all, address co-pollutants, local air pollution, and secondly, to target pollution reduction not only overall, but also in particular communities. However, the conclusion of that study is probably not correct. A more thorough analysis of the cap and trade scheme found that rather than widening environmental justice gaps, the scheme actually contributed to their reduction. Nevertheless, the influence of the Cushing study, along with other motives for opposition to carbon pricing, have resulted in unqualified opposition to carbon pricing as a, quote, false solution. And here are some of the arguments that have been made in a report sponsored by the Indigenous Environmental Network and Climate Justice Alliance. And these are echoed in another report by the NAACP. I'm not going to address them all in detail, but they are addressed point for point in the paper. The first objection is that carbon pricing is a false solution that doesn't keep fossil fuel in the ground. Well, I would say to this, first of all, that if an extractor can only take oil, coal, or gas out of the ground with a permit, then the cap on permits, in fact, keeps additional fossil fuels in the ground. And stopping pipelines and drilling are essential steps to the battle against climate change, but these measures need pricing of carbon as a complement. As James Boyce has pointed out, if all the oil were stopped from, say, the Alberta tar sands, without carbon pricing to reduce demand, then oil would be supplied by another producer like Saudi Arabia, outside the jurisdiction where the oil drilling was stopped. If enough oil is kept in the soil, the price will rise, but the money will go to those who have taken the oil out of the soil. And finally, the argument is made that carbon pricing is part of a racist and colonialist global system and must be opposed globally. The atmosphere must not be privatized. To this complex point, I will simply make a point about carbon pricing as commodification of the atmosphere. Carbon pricing, the right kind, robust and without any loopholes, is not privatizing the atmosphere so much as it is reclaiming it as a commons from those who have been allowed to desecrate it for free. Of course, none of these arguments are likely to reverse the opposition to carbon pricing in the near term. Even the Carbon Tax Center, a longtime supporter of carbon prices and dividends, has concluded that the time is not ripe for a carbon tax in the United States, but they still see a carbon tax as coming in at a later stage in the process. And the long strategy involves two stages. First, building green or at least greener infrastructure and paying for it by taxing corporate wealth. And only secondly, instilling carbon cutting incentives in every cranny and capillary of the economy via a revenue neutral carbon price. It is in stage 2 that carbon pricing as a route to basic income may again become salient. In the meantime, supporters can keep the idea alive. And in the shorter term, in the United States, the expansion of the child tax credit is where the action is for basic income.
Right. Well, thank you, Michael, for that video. Obviously, we'll come back and talk about the questions itself later on. If you could just bear with me because of the problems we were having with the because of the problems that Susa was having with loading, I'll have to load the second video, so just wait 1 minute. This one, we will do Luisa's video next. Just 1 minute. Right. Okay. Just bear with me for 1 minute, please. Share screen. Speech. Share. Right. And full screen. That should be it. Right.
First of all, I would like to thank the BN Congress organization for the opportunity to present the partial result of a research I've been developing on the relationship between universal basic income and green transition. This research has as its focus the principle of just transition and job creation presented in the American and European versions of the Green New Deal. What I'm presenting here is thought originally as a postdoctoral project, which has now been turned into an article. The original version already had this organization around 4 axes of analysis, which will be further developed in an extended version. In the last 3 years, this postdoctoral project has not found public funding to be developed, which led me to 2 important observations that I would like to share with you in this introduction, in the form of a brief personal account about the condition of being an unemployed academic and, in fact, being part of the concept and reality of the precariat. So what I'm saying here is that I do not just analyze the concept of the precariat, I am the precariat. And there would be no other possible way for me to present myself here in this Congress. I am the precariat. And considering the dismantling of everything in my country of origin, Brazil, considering also the transformation of the university professor into a content producer, considering the migration from physical teaching to distance learning, which will tend to make the profession of professor or researcher even more precarious, in the later case, also given the competition for funding in all parts of the world, and etc. I was forced to, in the personal level, to confront this problem. Now going back to the 2 observations I was talking about at the beginning, the first has to do with the problem of interdisciplinarity in social sciences. And I put here this in these terms as a problem. And the second, with the so-called theories of postmodernity. From the point of view of interdisciplinarity, discussing basic income from the perspective of theories of cognitive capitalism, immaterial labor, and biopolitical production is seen in many fields as inconsistent, for not precisely belonging to the field of economics or as an abandoning of Marxist categorical critique and its theory of crisis, but first of all, these theories are considered inconsistent for not presenting empirical data. Although these theories offer an important perspective for thinking about basic income with a focus on the current conditions of work in the contemporary world, which would lead us to a different notion of how it could be otherwise financed. On the other hand, authors of the so-called critique of labor and of value, such as Moishe Postone, Anselm Jappe, or in the case of this research, I mentioned Robert Woods in Germany, remain, in my view, still too closed in theoretical discussions that find little resonance on the left in public policy, as well as in the public sphere. And both the critiques of labor and value, as well as the authors of postmodernity, such as Antonio Negri, André Gotz, Maurizio Lazzarato, or, broadly speaking, cognitive capitalism, discussing basic income on the basis of these theories has been a great challenge in the academy. And this has been so because taking the critique of labor and of value as a basis, it is not even possible to approach the institutional left or the field of public policy with this discourse. Left-wing parties everywhere in the world seems to have long since abandoned the critique of the foundations of capitalist categories. On the other hand, the postmodern authors do, and do it very well, with an approach that comes closer to the discussion in the public sphere, a kind of X-ray of the labor situation today and the transformations of capitalism. But I also see few of them occupying discussion spaces like this one, for example, or pushing, for example, arguments in favor of taxing media companies, carbon taxes, or some other kind of discourse that advocates decoupling basic income and labor taxes. With that in mind, I decided to assume the theoretical contradiction of working, even so, with both categorical critique, in the case of the latter, because I believe that they make us advance more profoundly in the theoretical field, and this is fundamental. And postmodern theories, believing that these theories together can bring solutions to the problem of financing basic income in a way that is more coherent and adapted to the labor situation today. In order to better address the central aspects of this research, I organize it into 4 axes of analysis. And now I'm going to mirror my computer screen so you can see the mind map that portrays this research. Let's start with the first, UBI in theory, cognitive capitalism, post-Marxism, and labor critique. Cognitive capitalism is understood here firstly as immaterial labor, communication, physical and digital, creation, innovation, marketing, care, research and development, and other forms of labor based on public funding like the cultural sector, digital peer-to-peer networks and creative industries. That is, forms of labor in which value shifts from abstract to immaterial labor. Second, as a system of accumulation based on the expropriation of immaterial labor and the transformation of knowledge into fictitious commodities. Third, the process by which immaterial labor is converted into constant capital, that is, the part of capital that is converted into means of production. In this context, the management of a continuous flow of information and the creation of different functions and services adapted to the digital economy with a tiny social return on what is produced at the corporate level or is spontaneously generated in digital social networks. And fourth, a process through which weight relations are altered and an artificial extended working time is created. The question I'm bringing at this point, and that I want to observe deeply in the further development of this paper, is asking if these new deals are able also to bring in its core an overcoming of cognitive capitalism itself, deepening the relationship between green transition as a shift in the capitalist mode of production and just transition as the inclusion of those most affected by unemployment and climate disasters is an indispensable part of any study on social justice and income or wealth redistribution today. Relating these two models, however, green transition and cognitive capitalism, leads us to return to fundamental points of the discussion on cognitive capitalism that are still important for the theoretical development of arguments and policies in favor of the implementation of unconditional basic income on other bases other than labor tax. Taking into account the context of the climate crisis, many of the studies on green transition link job losses to natural disasters, cyclones, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and currently the coronavirus pandemic. These reasons are unquestionable and cause side effects such as mass migration, increased poverty, wars, and conflicts involving the dispute for territorial and natural resources. However, the climate approach to the crisis often puts the crisis of labor in general, but specifically from the perspective of the expropriation of the commons in the digital economy in the background. And this is a key point when discussing basic income. In other words, how could the positive externalities, the commons-based production and cyberspace, be redistributed in a society with less and less work? Or in what way could this collective production be redistributed in the form of social dividends in a society that produces ever more commodities with ever less labor? Assuming that the green transition is at the heart of the structural crisis of cognitive capitalism, the conversion to a circular economy where we would only consume what we can recycle or reuse will depend on the ability of economies to move away from a regime of productivist growth. The conversion to an inclusive growth regime requires investment in small and medium-sized enterprises, coupled with a strong social commitment. Moreover, it cannot depend solely on the will and efforts of governments, nor can it withstand the blind forces of an unregulated free market for long. These requirements drive the development of new forms of social integration. They invite participants to reflect on the place and role of UBI as a tool to support the population. They call for an in-depth reflection on its role in providing economic support for the development of independent entrepreneurship. The main challenge is in justifying the establishment of an universal and unconditional basic income based on forms of collection other than taxation of labor, lies in the way of conceiving and recognizing the productive dimension of social cooperation and communication, the nature and the share of social wealth produced and distributed in return. This question comes down to defining who produces what, in what way, on what basis the amount of UBI is defined and allocated. In sum, to what extent the collectively constructed value is recognized at the social level. In the same light of reasoning, culture is understood here as a paradigm of work in general, and as a model for considering forms of production and income redistribution outside the wage relation. Funding policies in the cultural sector may offer theoretical and practical tools for redefining basic income, not as an emergency or conditional income, but as an income that is capable of supporting the intermittency of non-production periods and the interstice between paid work, the making of a new project, investment in autonomous ventures, among other hegemonic aspects of work in cognitive capitalism. But relating UBI to the collective dimension of value production, culture, and social dividends, besides being a reality which is closer to the hegemonic form of labor in cognitive capitalism, it also leads us to the question of the internal limits and paradoxes of a basic income financed by oil dividends and raw materials, in contrast to what would be required for a green transition. The only form of unconditional basic income in existence, unconditional, is financed through oil trade revenues. The case of Alaska and the recent case of Maricá in the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Moving towards the end of this presentation, I would like to return to the initial research question, the relationship between UBI and green transition, taking into consideration the aspect of job creation and just transition present in the European and American Green New Deals. An important question in this context is to ask in what ways and what kinds of work would be created in the context of a green economy. Would these new jobs go beyond the field related, directly related to the green transition itself? This green transition is based in its main goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 60% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reach the ultimate goal of zero net global emissions by 2050, and can be found in the various versions of the Green New Deal of European Union and countries such as South Korea, United Kingdom, Canada, United States. The main goal of the green transition is to reverse the exploitation of nature of industrial capitalism, transform rural and urban infrastructure, and create renewable energy sources for the transport sector, construction, food, production, and so on. The Green New Deal, the American Green New Deal puts itself forward as a call for mobilization and calls for a leading role for the US in reducing emissions, given its position as one of the world's largest emitting carbon dioxide countries. In addition to these goals, directly linked to greenhouse reduction, the twin challenges of creating millions of good, high-wage jobs provided unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security and tackling systemic injustice appear as equally important. But expanding the welfare state and at the same time creating new good and high-wage jobs are, however, the biggest obstacles to implementing the New Deal anywhere in the world. In this sense, the American Green New Deal turns to the promotion of justice through, in the words of the document, the reparation of historical oppression, and clearly addresses the systemic injustice which affects in greater proportions indigenous people, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth, which are referred to in the agreement as frontline and vulnerable communities. The European Green New Deal, in turn, is presented as an initial roadmap to guide policies and measures to be taken in the coming years. It has similar targets to the US plan regarding the reduction of greenhouse gases, but it's more complex in describing how to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and assumes that climate neutrality targets are partially possible, as it takes a generation, 25 years, to transform the industrial sector and its value chains. Going to the end to my presentation, it's even possible to conclude from the targets presented, especially in the European plan, that there is indeed an opening for creating new jobs. However, all of these changes involve changes in behavior first and foremost. It involves the necessity for real changes in the form of production. This is why I asked at the beginning, would the green transition also bring in its core the overcoming of cognitive capitalism itself as a system through which the collective dimension of knowledge production is privatized with a tiny social return on what is produced at the corporate level or spontaneously generated in digital social networks? Without this, I see little future of work in the context of the green transition. Thank you very much.
Right, welcome back. We'll play the third video in a minute. If you could bear with us for a few seconds while we try and get rid of this annoying ping that has been going on. So if you could just bear with us while we try and
Neil,
Yeah, okay.
We've fixed it, we've worked it out and we fixed it, so we can proceed.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, thanks, Susa. Okay, I'll just load the third video. Let's get rid of that. I'm trying to come out of full screen. This is Leticia's video, which we're now going to play. I don't think she has come in at all, so we won't be able to take any questions on this one when we come back into the system later. Okay, we've got it there. Right.
Hello everyone, well, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Letícia Soares Honório. I am a master in Smart and Sustainable Cities, and I am a civil engineer. I'm from Brazil. I will present the paper entitled Proposition of Fund for Citizens' Basic Income through the Structuring of Post-Consumption Waste. In the introduction, I started by saying that developing countries suffer from unique territories fluctuation between social extremes. Social spatial segregation was used as an instrument of control of urban spaces by a ruling class, according to their interests, divided into rings. Urbanism was consolidated in the center, and the periphery become a mark of Latin American cities. This format reports countless other problems: political, social, economic, ideological, the lack of structure and public services such as sanitation and solid waste in the peripheries, consolidated the relationship of approximation of the community with factors that influence social and environmental vulnerability or environmental problems. Solid waste management is one of the main factors responsible for environmental impact. The social and environmental vulnerability was defined as population groups with high deprivation that live or circulate in areas of environmental degradation or risk. The citizens' basic income has been successful in the eradication process of poverty. To achieve sustainable growth in cities, it is essential to create opportunities for employment, income, better living conditions, and the environment. However, it competes with policy allocations of investments according to the activities and priorities demanded by society. The divergent groups that make up society compete with each other due to the conflict of interests over the destination of investments. In the sense, resources are needed to subsidize the implementation of the basic income program. This article focuses on investigating the creation of a new subsidy fund for citizens' basic income in developing countries. The fund explores the economic potential of household solid waste generated in the city that is not used. The Brazilian law recognized solid waste as an economic good that generates employment and income, with promotes citizenship, social inclusion, and has social values. By introducing the circular economy strategy in countries in development, recipes are generated. Today, following the Brazilian average, in São Paulo, on average less than 3% of household solid waste is recycled, even with disposal of the selective collection program by the city. In order to achieve significant adherence values, a public-private community cooperation initiative is proposed in this article. In this way, a new fund would be made possible for the basic income of citizenship in an alternative form of distribution. Research methodology. As for the present objective of investigating the creation of a new subsidy fund for citizens' basic income in developing countries, it was decided to carry out quantitative descriptive research. Scenario: São Paulo is a Brazilian municipality, is the most popular city in Latin America, which has a high demand for management of waste, contributed to the choice as a city. Results and discussions. To encourage the community to separate waste at the source and help raise environmental awareness, the project is developing a local social currency with the help of the Paulista network of community banks. The incentive take place as follows. When registering for the project, the resident receives a magnetic card and is introduced to download the application of internet banking and cash. Recyclables are collected by waste pickers of recyclable materials associated with the door-to-door project in households registered in the Corre Moeda Mudas project. At the time of collection, the collector identified the intended material and weighs it. In exchange, the community residents receive local social currency credits in proportion to the type and amount of the recyclable material. With the currency, the community makes purchases in small local business registered in the project. This format injects money into small establishments and services in the neighborhood, which results in economic development in the region. Final considerations: funds for basic income could come from of the economy generated in public coffers due to the mass recovery of domestic solid waste fulfilled by recyclable materials collectors, and gives cooperation public-private community generation of bottom-up projects that recognize the local context and employ the best actions for the circular economy and return value to society. Thank you very much.
That is the third video. Firstly, my apologies, I left my sound on by mistake for the first 2 or 3 minutes of that. So hopefully we can get that. Can you just bear with me for 1 minute while I find out what questions we have actually been brought forward to come forward, and to try and get rid of the background screen which we have. Just bear with me for 1 minute, please. Close that. Right. Sorry, just bear with me, please. Come back to the questions that we have. Right. Well, we'll start with this question which we have here from James Mulvale. Would James would be interested in the panelists' view of job guarantee as a component of transition to a green economy? Would a comprehensive job guarantee, as distinct from targeted creation of green jobs, accelerate economic growth and work against a sustainable, steady-state economy? I think perhaps, I would add to that, how would that fit to the whole UBI, Universal Basic Income agenda? So we have 2 panelists here, Michael and Lucia. Take them in order in which they came. Do you have any thoughts on either of that? Say, Michael, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, my attitude toward general universal job guarantees has always been that if the jobs fill a needed public good that is not being supplied otherwise, then it makes sense to create jobs. But if you create jobs simply to keep people occupied when you could otherwise give them an unconditional income, you're simply engaged in what Friedrich von Parijs called job fetishism. And I think that applies in the context of green jobs as well. There's plenty of work that needs to be done. We have a very short time to do it, so I have no problem with public investment in jobs, building windmills, installing solar panels, and other such important green investments. But I don't think that it needs to take the form of a universal job guarantee. And one last thing I would say, I didn't have time for this in my talk, but there's a brief comment at the end of the paper that another dimension of basic income in relationship to climate change is that we need to aim for a society that is reducing its material consumption overall. And people tend to consume more, including more energy and carbon emissions, as their income increases. So if we could improve human life while decreasing the amount that we all work, then I think we would all be better off. And a basic income can enable us to reduce our working hours while at the same time maintaining a normal standard of living. And if we all power down together, it will not feel like a deprivation. And this applies to affluent countries. I think developing countries need to be increasing their consumption in many ways. So we have to make room for that, which means there's an imperative to reduce our consumption even more.
Before I ask Louisa to comment on the question, I'd just say, Michael, that was when we were volunteering for this this conference to support it. That was exactly my thinking about one of the reasons why I'm very keen on what UBI is able to do, because as we move to a lower resource economy, which is what we will need to do, we cannot assume that the current balance of sort of assuming that everybody has to get a job and has to keep a full-time job is the right way to go forward, because it just increases consumption and is actually something we need to be powering down another way. That's a comment from myself as the host rather than any question to that, but thank you for that comment. So perhaps, Louisa, if perhaps do you have any thoughts on this question?
In my view, I think it's impossible. Job guaranteeing is something impossible to have. I do not believe in this possibility because, as Michael said, if job guarantee is a way only to maintain people occupied, it's not interesting anyway. So that's why in my research, I was looking through the collective production of the peer-to-peer commons-based production in cyberspace, as well as care economy, as the place we need to invest in the future, because the green jobs, I think it's related in the green transition. These green new jobs will be related to sustainable ways of producing renewable energies or something like that. But there is a lot of other ways of working that, in my view, it will be excluded in these green jobs. That's why for me it's important to take the social networks, the communication and the care economy, and as I said, the culture as a paradigm of work, as the hegemonic way of work, and to invest somehow in these professions and this work through a basic income.
Thank you for that as well, Louisa. And I think that's a really interesting approach as well.